Yo everybody, it's your boy King Crowder, back again with a history lesson you may not know, or something that is not taught in detail for sure. Today's lesson, we will focus on Sundown Towns, also known as Sunset Town, Gray Towns, or Sun-owned Towns. These are places in the United States that practice racial segregation in their community to all non-white citizens. They have accommodation of local laws, intimidation, and violence used to post in their town of people in their community after dark. The entire country has sundown towns to this day. Let me repeat that again. The entire United States have sundown towns until this day. This process was really discriminatory practice that kept Black residents out of white communities. Think about when we always heard in the 70s when you would hear Black people moving into different parts of communities in the United States and white flight will begin to happen, which we will discuss that later in the video. This video breaks down how the houses experience some form of racial violence, discriminatory actions, or even defaming their property. Entire communities were known about this town, where they would literally say, if you were here after dark, we can kill you with impunity. You began to see this happen at the beginning of the Reconstruction era. Think about that for a second. 1800s is when you seen this act and civil disobedient practice started. Many people knew about this act in this court decision of Shelley versus Kramer, when many towns were not allowed to discriminate against Blacks. Think about this. In 1948, it took a Supreme Court justice case to talk about this situation. People were living in these towns all across America and could not afford to go there because they were virtually boxed out. In these sundown towns, you would see laws where it's difficult to get the property. Where few Blacks live, you can't move in this community. You have to qualify for this. Sundown towns is something practice we see all the time, especially with different laws in different communities. It's very difficult to get in here because the literal social norms are, let's keep our town safe. Let's keep the outsiders out. One example that was really prominent was you can look back in Louisville, Kentucky in 1911. It restricted Black people from even going to certain parts of town. You could only live here. You could only do this. City planners and city officials and real estate companies were actively in this practice. The Fair Housing Act was coming up and accommodated because sundown towns were so prominent and still actively present in America. Sundown towns resulted in most people virtually saying, you cannot come to this town because if you do, we will insert violence. The reason why you can look at some historical books and older white people saying, I don't literally see as much prejudice or racial bias that I see, is literally because they had sundown towns being enforced inside of their communities. You are not allowed to go here. You are not allowed to see this. I live in a community where only this happens. If you are not familiar with something called the Negro Motorist Green Book, it was a guide for Black Americans around this time to know places that you were safe to travel to, safe to stay at, and where you and your family could be acceptable. Because around that time, prior in the early 19th century, 1950s, it was not acceptable for you to go to white towns at night because something would happen to you and your family members, and the law would not help you. Sundown Towns is one of America's black eye, along with convict leasing and sorts, that we still have not talked about or educated ourselves on completely. We see these towns and historical data still being shown actively. The great author James Lowe has a website breaking down how the sundown towns were happening in the United States. This issue is still prevalent in the 21st century. Sundown towns have not gone away. Ferguson, Missouri, if you might have known it through the incident, had quite a history of sundown town as early as 2014. These towns across America have not been disbanded because the anti-black things that were going on have not been structurally dismantled. We see these issues going on around the country and we wonder how and why these things happen. Looking at our legacy and our history, we can see these things. Another incredible thing that's going on right now that most people don't know, Chicago enacted a 6 p.m. curfew for most youth in May of 2022. At Millennium Park, they was literally stop and enforce the young blacks from coming there. Think about this. 6 p.m. in Chicago, they would literally move them away and say, you can't be outside this location. We have these moments, and while Sundown Towns are such a thing and an issue still going on, and it is not dedicated to just a certain part of the United States. We have Chicago, we have New Jersey, we have isolated places and demographics that confirm you can only live in certain location. If you ever wonder why you see a stark black population town or city in immediate drop for the next 10 years, these are the policies that affect it. Sundown Town, again, local municipalities blocking out specifically blacks and all colored people from living in certain regions. You do not have access to these goods. You cannot go to these locations. And the historical context is you are not allowed to go live or be in my city. You can shop at my stores. You can come to my businesses to spend your money, but you are not allowed to be equal or on the same footing as me. Sundown Towns in America, it is something highly we need to educate the youth and people on how this practice happened. Violence, intimidation, scare tactics, exclusion, and killing was what kept these towns limited and segregated as they have been throughout U.S. history. Hopefully you learned a lot about why Sundown Towns happen, how they happen, and why this information is important. It's your boy, King Crowder, checking out again. Peace.